So what this references is the event you said was the worst, and what you have filled in here is 3 words. IPV by Johnny, right?
Correct.
All right. And then what happened is the next box, and you've not written a single thing in the box, right?
Because I've already spent 20 some odd hours with Ms. Heard, I know what goes in that box. If you look at the top, it says administer the life of check checklist or an other structured trauma screen. That screen had already been conducted.
Right, but there's a box on the gold standard test that asks what happened, and it says, how old were you? How were you involved? Who else was involved? Was anyone seriously injured or killed? Was anyone in life danger? And none of that information you provide in your analysis on the CAPS 5.
Your Honor, I hesitate to object, but that's very compound.
It is.
Okay, I'll sustain the objection if you want to rephrase.
We can do it
Okay.
the slow way. The first question is, how old were you?
All of the information that would go in that box is contained in my 80-plus clinical notes of my evaluation of Ms. Heard up until this point. It would have been incredibly redundant to do that again here.
But you knew other people would review this, didn't you?
And I knew that they would have my clinical notes as well.
Oh, so they're supposed to parse through your clinical notes so that they can figure out what you chose to be the anchoring event.
I didn't choose to be the anchor. The client chooses to the anchor to identify what the worst event is for them.
You wrote IPV by Johnny. That's what you determined to be the anchoring event.
When I asked Ms. Heard, once again, of the traumatic events that she experienced in her life, which one is the worst, this is what she indicated.
Okay. But you provided no details with respect to it.
There are a plethora of details in my 80-page is a handwritten, single-spaced clinical notes.
Right. All right. Let's go to the next page. All right. You felt it appropriate to fill this page out, didn't you, Doctor?
Well, these are the questions about the symptoms, so I'm asking specific questions and getting her responses.
Didn't you know this already?
Well, I was making sure at this point, having not seen her for a year, what is the trauma expression at this time? It can change over time. It could go away. It can get better. It can get worse.
All right. Why don't we go a couple more pages in? Let's go into page 7 of 20. Now, there are a couple of boxes that you filled in on this. Let's look at item 5, B5. You don't provide any indication of what kind of triggers, what kind of reminders trigger these reactions.
She answered that on the previous questions.
All right. And you didn't provide any answer as to how long does it take to recover.
She has some difficulty recovering.
Okay. And then there's this question that says, how often has this happened in the past month? Number of times.
Correct.
And we talked about how these things are scored, and we looked at, you got to look at frequency and intensity, right?
Correct.
And you left the frequency box blank.
Well, no, if she said several times a month, then that's what the frequency is.
And you didn't fill that frequency box in at all.
Because she told me it was frequently several times a month, which is one of the anchors encoding the CAPS.
All right, let's look at the next one. The very next box. Again, this is scored by frequency and intensity. How often in the past month?
Correct.
Blank.
Pardon?
How often in the past month? You left that one blank again, right?
She tells me it happens at least twice a week, so certainly I could multiply 2 times 4 and put in 8.
And you certainly could have written the number 2.
But it wasn't 2, if it's
Oh.
happening 2 times a week.
All right, so 2 times a week towards times the number of months. Now you got 2 digits instead of 1, right? That's all it took to write that down.
This is in a 1-month period, so it would have been a 4-week period.
How often in the past month? That's what it says.
Correct. You
You
said
chose
months.
not to answer that question. Let's look at the next page. Again, scoring is frequency and intensity. How often in the past month? Again, you left it blank.
If you look on the right-hand box, that is where we are indicating the frequency and the severity. If you can see where I circled moderate, it's happening more than twice a month. That's where I'm indicating the frequency of the symptom expression.
Okay. But aren't you skipping a step? You're supposed to do intensity and frequency.
And when somebody says it's happening more than twice a month, that is a frequency indicator.
All right. Let's go to the next box. Again, we have, in the past month, how many of the important parts of event have you difficulty remembering? Number of important aspects. Didn't fill it up.
Well, I listed 2 specific incidents of where she indicates she has important aspects that are missing.
But all you had to do was put a number in here. You knew how to score this thing.
Well, this measure actually doesn't get scored by the frequency.
All right, you know something, you're right. Let's look at the next one.
I know.
The next one gets scored by the frequency. That's blank, right?
Well, I did not code it as a PTSD symptom.
Okay, let's go to the next one. How much of the time in the past month have you felt that way as a percentage?
Right? So as you can see, I circled 20 to 30% of the time.
Right. But
It's
you
just
didn't
as I'm putting it on the right side in the box where I'm coding the instrument.
We're going to talk about the right side in a minute. You took issue with the way that Dr. Curry did this test, didn't you?
Correct.
Right. But your test, in every instance where you're asked the number of times and to fill in the blank, you leave it blank.
They're on the right side of the document.
All right. You want to talk about the right side of the document? Let's do that. After you did the CAPS 5 for the anchoring, the 3-word anchoring event, IPV by Johnny, you went back through again and said, maybe I should consider childhood trauma as well, right?
I wanted to test for the limits and see at this point in time, Ms. Heard had a child, and sometimes when people have children, their trauma gets evoked. Is she having those symptoms as well? She already had, based on this instrument, the PTSD from the interpersonal violence. I wanted to see if there were any additional symptoms.
All right. And you knew that she had had severe child abuse as a young person.
That is correct.
She grew up in a home full of heroin addicts, right?
Opiate abuse, yes.
Yeah. And there was IPV between her parents.
Correct.
All right. And so you wanted to make sure that there wasn't some impact with this childhood trauma in the diagnosis of PTSD.
Yes.
Right. And so you decided to give her the test again.
Well, I didn't give it again. What's called testing the limits. I went back to some of the questions where she answered in the affirmative and said, and is this also happening vis-a-vis your childhood abuse? Are you also having intrusive thoughts and feelings about childhood? Are you avoiding thinking about things about childhood? Is that happening for you now as well?
All right. So there are a series of notations on the right-hand side. Let's go to page 5 of 20 in the test. All right. Why don't we highlight the right-hand notations that start under the word childhood? All right. So the way you tested for childhood PTSD is to write a notation in the corner and answer a couple of questions. Same test.
Well, I wasn't administering a whole CAPS again. What I was doing was seeing, as we know with people who have what we call polyvictimization or revictimization, someone could in fact meet criteria for the PTSD from the domestic violence, but then they're also experiencing some symptoms as a result of the childhood abuse. Both can occur.
Right. But Mr. Depp isn't responsible for her childhood abuse.
That is correct.
Right. And the way you tested this childhood abuse PTSD is you made notations on the in the right-hand column of a form that you partially filled out for the IPV by Johnny, right?
Well, I disagree with the partially filled out. The frequency was clearly filled out in the box where we score the CAPS. But yes, I did write about the childhood to the right of that box.
Okay. And that is the appropriate way that the gold standard test for PTSD for childhood trauma should be administered.
If there were any affirmatives and I needed to go further, I could have administered another CAPS 5. There were not. I did not need to do that.
Okay. So you chose not to do a second CAPS 5, although you knew that she had suffered from severe childhood trauma.
No, because she wasn't suffering symptoms at that point in time, PTSD symptoms from the childhood trauma.
All right.